Hello and welcome. In the next few minutes, I'm going to try to persuade you that we are already in the midst of the most severe crisis that humanity has ever faced. A crisis indeed so severe that it threatens our very existence as a species, not to mention 1 million or so other species on the planet, and our complete destruction and eradication within perhaps only a few short decades. However, the message today is not entirely negative, catastrophic, and somber. I also want to try to persuade you in this brief time that it is possible to avoid this catastrophe, and that there is, provided we muster the collective will to do so, a way even to make a better world than the world we had before this catastrophe began. So let's start with language. A principal means not only of understanding, but also of changing the world. The problem I'm addressing, I don't want to call climate change. That's the vernacular we encounter every day. I don't want to call it global warming either. Some of you may remember as recently as a few decades ago when people said, well, global warming is coming to Britain. And some responded, well, that means we can grow more wine in southern England, right? And we have warmer summers. It'll be nice, won't it? This sends entirely the wrong message. The message I want to address is catastrophic environmental breakdown. So let's start with where we are now. What's happening to the Earth? We're destroying it. This picture, some of you will recognize from the press of this week, from Athens, but the burning of the planet, even in this week, we could have taken representations from Siberia, from Canada, from parts of the rest of southern Europe. The basic fact of what we knew beforehand as global warming, but what I want to portray as something much more serious, is that the Earth gets hotter and hotter. We get warmer and warmer, the planet burns. This diagram gives us a good idea of the pattern of burning at the moment. You'll notice Siberia here, you'll notice North America, but look at how much red there is in Southern America. Look at how much red there is in Southern Africa. This is only from, as you see, early August this year. If we reach the winter of this year, the pattern shifts, of course. Australia becomes one of the reddest places on the planet. The ice melts, of course. The glaciers melt. The polar ice caps melt. Not just the Himalayas, but the Arctic and the Antarctic as well. And catastrophic weather events follow. This again from the past month in Germany, but we could have taken a dozen other examples. And then, of course, things get drier where they're not getting wetter. This will be a worldwide phenomena very soon, within the next couple of decades. The widespread desertification and aridification of formerly crop-growing regions and animal-dwelling regions, of course, follows. So too does the massive destruction of animal species. Bees, of course, are the most important, perhaps, in this process. We will lose all the larger animals relatively quickly in the next few decades, but bees enable us to eat, of course. So, what causes this? As you're well aware, this debate's been going on for a very long period of time. It's still highly controversial, but almost everybody agrees that the human component, which is a very large proportion, and the only proportion we can do anything about, is emissions of so-called greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane being the most important. Taking fossil fuels from the ground and from under the oceans, principally oil, but also natural gas, the principal cause in turn. This is methane burning in Siberia, one of the first tipping points, as they're called, points at which, if the environment begins to degrade so severely that we cannot any longer prevent a particular process from occurring, this may lead to an irreversible trend of events, whereby no matter how much we want to stabilize or reverse the process of environmental destruction, we will no longer be able to do so. The warming of the tundra in Siberia is one such event, and the water itself burns. This is beef production in the Amazon. Now, I will come on a bit later to speak about how individuals can change their behavior. To produce a kilogram of beef takes about 100,000 liters of water. In the case of the Amazon, the so-called lungs of the planet, it's also the case, as you're probably well aware from the press recently, that the Amazon now emits more gases than it is able to sustain. So this map, which shows what was once believed to be beyond the worst case scenario, you're aware that the basic debate I'm addressing today centers on a 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius kind of comfort zone for people, whereby in the last 20 years in particular or so, we've thought that this was likely and or desirable and or feasible, possible, and so on. This has now been thrust completely aside in the last half dozen years or so. This is a realistic depiction of what is a likely scenario by 2070, 2080. Nobody is absolutely fixed on the date, but that it will happen now seems extremely likely unless we act. The one thing I think to take home about this diagram, it's a bit difficult to read the small print, I appreciate. The yellow band in the middle is essentially uninhabitable terrain. See how far north this comes in Europe? Through southern France, including all of Spain, all of the Mediterranean areas, and including all of the United States. The message is very clear. We're at 1.25 degrees Celsius warming above a base rate in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, around 1750. Forget 1.5 degrees, forget 2 degrees. 1.25 degrees is too much. So the slogans that follow, 1 degree is too much, because 1.5 degrees will take us, even 1.25 degrees, will take us to 3 and 4 and 5 and possibly even 6 degrees. And the second slogan, keep it in the ground as fast as possible. Keep the fossil fuels where they are. So the second conclusion to be drawn from this, of course, this is not just drilling for gas and oil and using energy, which has produced the catastrophic scenario we face today. It is the general trend towards consumerism, which we've seen develop over the last 2 centuries. This is a question, of course, addressed to all of us. Are you a slave to consumerism? Answer for most of the developed and wealthy countries is yes, we are. I shop, therefore I am. To one degree or another, we have come to define ourselves increasingly by the goods we possess and the goods we consume, to the degree to which our very personalities are bound up with that perception of the things we have. And this needs to change. We all know what they are, the symbols of luxury. Pick your poison. Money and good taste don't always go together. You can have this for $1 million a week, evidently. This illustration of Black Friday, the kind of frenzy that we tend to get into when the chance of getting something which we regard as a luxury relatively cheap presents itself to us. Clothing, fast fashion so-called, is a real problem in terms of emissions. Clothing is something that individuals can immediately address in their own lifestyles relatively easily and relatively painlessly. There will be, of course, in the whole process of transition to a sustainable society, a fair amount of pain and a fair amount of collective willingness to deprive ourselves of having things that we've enjoyed having beforehand. What I'll argue in a moment is that we need to compensate for this by having fun in other ways. plastic in the oceans by 2050 or so. You all know that if you eat fish now, you have plastic in the fish. By 2050 or so, there'll be more plastic in the oceans than there are fish to start with. This is an illustration of the wanton voluntary destruction of brand new goods by the Amazon Corporation, which has recently been in the news. So worldwide, 99% of everything bought is no longer in use after 6 months. This is waste on a colossal scale. Too much stuff, not only in general, but in our own lives. You're all perhaps familiar with the concept of Earth Overshoot Day. This diagram illustrates how around 1970, we consumed about the same number of resources that were required to keep the planet stable. By 2021, we would require 1.7 Earths of resources to do the same thing. Pretty obvious where the trend is taking us. It's taking us to, and I could have used 1,000 other images for this, dystopia, a nightmarish state where we live in a constant state of fear and anxiety. So the solution has to, I think, obviously I'm biased in this regard, has to be utopian. We can't just tell off the oil and gas companies and say, well, life might get a little bit better. We have to envision using this opportunity, and the opportunity itself forces us in this direction, to make a rather better world than we started with in the first instance. Is it this utopia? I don't think so. This kind of fantasy that billionaires like to present us with is just a distraction, a harmful distraction as well. It's rather something more like this utopia, the island map of Thomas More's famous text of 1516. This has been represented in literary form vis-a-vis the environmental movement since 1975, when Kallenbach's Ecotopia was published, in a number of different ways. You may have read or have read reviews of the most recent, I think, penetrating text of this kind, Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future, which was published in 2020. So here's a brief presentation of the agenda that's required here. I call it a radical Green New Deal. It comprises a generous universal basic income. That's to say, you'll be paid a sufficient amount to live on without having to work. Higher income and wealth taxes will be needed, of course, to fund environmental reconstruction. We'll need to end offshore tax havens and tax evasion. We need to reduce the work week relatively quickly by 2030 to 4 days. This alone will reduce emissions by some 20%. We could include co-ownership and reduced corporate hierarchies. A sustainable economy is obviously part of the goal, can only be accomplished with a transparent democracy in which the current control over so many parts of the democratic process by financial elites is abolished. Green neighborhood-centered cities, fairly obvious. Part of the bonus then, we need to offer carrots throughout this process. Free public transport, we want to get people out of cars, remember? Even electric cars, because we can't have as many electric cars as we have petrol and diesel cars. We want to get them onto public transport, and I think at least, I'm in favor of free international train travel, but at least let's think of free domestic train travel for everyone. So, of course, across the board, in every aspect of our lives, there has to be reduced consumption. Quite a lot of this can be done without making us terribly unhappy. But in addition, the public, the state, if you like, neighborhoods, cities, and so on, need to make many more opportunities for us to come together. We have become, in the era of the commodification of our sense of self, more and more isolated from one another. And the pandemic, of course, has exacerbated this entire process. We need to come together much more. We can enjoy each other's company in festivals, in public dining, and so on, to an extraordinary degree in a way that is not possible at the moment. One vision of what such a green city might look like. This is how it's going to be done. 100% sustainable energy, absolutely feasible by 2030. Don't let anybody tell you that the contrary is the case. So we end with a festival, and we end with a statement or restatement of our goals. Minimally, we cut emissions by 50% by 2030 and 100% by 2040. We really wanted to be serious about this and hedge our bets to an even greater degree. It would be 100% by 2030, but the will is not yet there to do that. The goal can no longer be, no matter what you read in the paper, no matter what you read in the press, 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. It has to be 1 degree or below. So 1 degree is too much. The one thought I want you to take home. Reclaim the future. The only way you'll do it is by getting out in the streets and making everybody else aware, and our governors aware, that this has to be done. It has to be done dramatically quickly. It has to be done radically. We have to remake ourselves as well as the societies we live in. Thank you very much.